This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitsuhone have in store?
Hi everyone! Every Friday this month I've been looking at a Halloween-inspired topic in an MTG Top 10, and so far we've looked at the best cards in Midnight Hunt, as well as the best vampires and the best bats, and today we're also looking at a spooky creature type, zombies, but with a different focus that I've never done before in a Top 10. Instead of looking at the zombie creature type broadly, which I did last October if you want to check that out, I want to look specifically at cards that pay you off for having zombies. In other words, cards that are better if you specifically have creatures with the zombie type in your deck. Zombies are actually tied with goblins and merfolk as the creature type that has been supported for the longest, as Zombie Master appeared alongside Lord of Atlantis and Goblin King in Alpha, and over the years zombies have continued to be one of the most heavily supported creature types, with entire blocks like Onslaught, Innistrad, and Amonkhet prominently featuring them. In this video, we'll take a look at the 10 zombie payoff cards that have left the biggest impact in competitive Magic the Gathering. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Crawl from the Cellar. For 1 black mana, it's a sorcery that returns a creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and it puts a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target zombie you control. It also has flashback for 3 generic and a black, which means you can pay that cost to cast it from your graveyard and exile it. While this card works in a deck with 0 zombies, it's substantially better in a zombie deck, since getting that counter means that this adds to the board while also getting you something back from the graveyard, and because of flashback it can do it more than once. Graveyard-oriented cards with flashback are always pretty nice, since it means if it ends up in the graveyard, even if you don't cast it, you still have access to it. Crawl from the Cellar saw a little bit of play in Standard and Dimir zombie decks, but it's done the most work in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. There it's played in spell-heavy Dimir decks that look to quickly load the graveyard and power out early Gurmag Anglers or Tolarian Terrors. Both of those massive creatures are scary when you can get them back a second time, and the Angler even happens to be a zombie, so you can put a counter on it. It looks like Crawl from the Cellar is likely to continue to gain points in Pauper going forward. At number 9, it's Lord of the Accursed. It's 2 generic and a black for a 2/3, and it's a pretty traditional zombie lord. In other words, it offers +1/+1 to your other zombies. You can also pay 1 generic and a black to give all of your zombies menace. If you've got a bunch of zombies around, buffing them all and making them harder to block is pretty strong. Unsurprisingly, Lord of the Cursed was played in zombie decks in both Standard and Pioneer, but it hasn't put up any top 8 since 2019. At number 8, it's Diregraph Colossus. For 2 generic and a black, it's a 2/2, and it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each zombie card in your graveyard, and whenever you cast a zombie spell, you create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. While it starts out with some pretty bad stats, the Colossus usually isn't going to just be a 2/2, and even if it is, it's great that the Colossus pays you off for having already done stuff with zombies, as well as doing stuff with zombies in the future. Generating a token every time you cast a zombie is no small thing, and the Colossus can build the kind of army that Lord of the Accursed can take advantage of, while also being massive if you get it in the late game. It was played in fairly straightforward zombie decks in Standard, and in Pioneer it's done work in more graveyard-focused zombie decks that have access to Stitcher's Supplier and other powerful self-mill. In those decks, the Colossus can be massive even on turn 3, however it hasn't put up a top 8 in any format since 2021. At number 7, it's Dark Salvation. For X, and a black, it's a sorcery that creates X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, and then up to 1 target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each zombie you control. This kind of design is pretty nice because it makes zombies for you while also paying you off for having them. That means it's never useless, though the removal effect does get far more potent in decks that have lots of zombies. Being able to add multiple zombies to the board and killing a creature is a lot of power for a single card. It's another card that's been played in both Standard and Pioneer zombie decks, but it's been inactive since 2022. At number 6, it's Liliana's Mastery. For 3 generic and 2 black, it's an enchantment that gives your zombies +1/+1, and it makes 2/2/2 zombie tokens. So on its own, Liliana's Mastery is 5 mana for 2 3/3s, which is a pretty good rate all on its own. But like Dark Salvation, it gets way better if you have other zombies around who can benefit from the buff. You can end up paying 5 mana to add a massive amount of power and toughness to the board. Its points all came in standard zombie decks in 2017. At number 5, it's Crypt Breaker. For 1 black mana, it's a 1/1, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and discard a card to make a 2/2 zombie. You can also tap 3 untapped zombies you control to draw a card and lose 1 life. Crypt Breaker is quite the card, especially at 1 mana, since it can turn into a useful discard outlet that generates important zombie bodies, which it can use to draw you a bunch of extra cards. This is another zombie payoff that can potentially fuel itself, but obviously you're going to really be in business if you play this in a deck with plenty of other zombies in it. Like several of the cards we've seen, Crypt Breaker was played in standard zombie decks and a bit in Pioneer zombie decks, but unlike those other cards, Crypt Breaker has gone on to see play in other formats too. In Modern, it's been played in zombie infestation decks, which are all about discarding cards for value while generating zombie tokens, and you can see how having an additional discard outlet that draws you cards with all those zombie bodies would be right at home alongside Crypt Breaker. Its peak in Modern came during the era of Bridge from Below dominance, though. That enchantment generates zombie tokens from the graveyard, giving you one every time a non-token creature you control dies. Crypt Breaker could turn those zombie bodies into additional cards while also helping you get the bridge into the graveyard in the first place. Crypt Breaker really reached its peak when Hogak was legal in the format, as it really broke Bridge from Below, since the bridge made it easier to get enough bodies in play to convoke Hogak into play in the extreme early game. Ultimately, both the bridge and Hogak got banned though, and Crypt Breaker hasn't had a home in Modern since 2019. It had a bit of a longer life in Legacy, where Hogak and the bridge are still legal, and it's also used sometimes to set up Reanimator decks, but it doesn't have any top 8s in 2024. At number 4, it's the Scarab God. For 3 generic, a blue, and a black, it's a 5/5, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. So, if you happen to have some zombies around, it can dole out lots of damage while improving your draws, and the Scarab God doesn't leave that entirely up to chance, because he can make zombies himself with his activated ability. For 2 generic, a blue, and a black, you can exile a creature card from a graveyard and make a token copy of it, except it's a 4/4 zombie. That ability packs serious power, as it lets you churn out really significant tokens, and at instant speed, while also making the Scarab God's upkeep trigger more potent. Like most gods, the Scarab God is super hard to permanently kill too, in this case because when it dies you return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. The Scarab God was one of the most dominant cards in Standard, where it was a very powerful win condition for control decks. They could kill and counter creatures all game long, until they played Scarab God and started turning those same creatures into 4/4 zombies, and then they would run away with the game. It even managed to put up a top 8 in a Grixis control deck in Modern. But other than Standard, Pioneer is where the Scarab God has been at its best, where it's been featured in straightforward control decks, but it's also been used in decks like Fires of Invention, which can cast spells for free, and so often have lots of mana for the god's activated ability, and it's also used in Niv Mizzet Reborn decks, which can pay you off for running powerful 2-colored cards like the god, who you can draw with Niv's trigger, and you can even use the god's ability to get that trigger more than once. The Scarab God is going to keep putting up top 8s going forward, but it's probably not going to ever manage to crack the top 3 on this list. At number 3, it's Gravecrawler. For 1 black mana, it's a 2/1 that can't block, and if you control a zombie, you can cast Gravecrawler from your graveyard. Gravecrawler has one of the strongest recursion effects in the game, since you can simply pay a single black mana to get it back, provided you control that zombie. This gets especially potent alongside free sacrifice effects, especially when you can do that sacrificing with a fellow zombie. In Standard, Gravecrawler was mostly played in various black and black-red aggro decks that featured several zombies. These decks ran Mortar Pod, which could give you a consistent source of damage if you sacrifice Gravecrawler to it. He's also gained points in modern Vengevine decks, where the two creatures can really feed off of one another, since Vengevine wants to be in the graveyard too, and when you cast multiple creature spells in a turn, it can come back, and having Gravecrawlers in your graveyard makes that a lot easier. These decks also usually use the aforementioned Bridge from Below, which itself makes sure you have zombies in play to bring back the Crawler. Gravecrawler has also been played in legacy combo decks called Zombie Bombardment that seek to just keep hitting the opponent with Goblin Bombardment and Gravecrawler. Like Crypt Breaker, it saw an uptick in play in Modern thanks to Modern Horizons, which not only introduced Hogak, but made Carrion Feeder legal in Modern for the first time. Those two were quite the engine, especially if you have a Bridge from Below in the graveyard, since you can just sacrifice Gravecrawler over and over, getting a zombie each time while also growing the feeder. Gravecrawler suffered some after both Hogak and Bridge from Below got banned, but it still continued to see a little bit of play in modern Vengevine decks. More recently, Modern Horizons 3 has resulted in a similar increase in how much Gravecrawler is played in the format, this time because of Warren's Soul Trader. The Trader has a sacrifice effect that costs no mana and sacrifices a creature and gives you a treasure, and it happens to be a zombie. So you can just cast Gravecrawlers as many times as you have life, since you can just use that treasure to cast it over and over again. And if you have Zolaport, Cutthroat, or Marionette and Prentice in play, that's a game-winning combo. Meanwhile, the Crawler has also continued to see play in Legacy Hogak decks. Gravecrawler is going to keep amassing points, especially in Modern. At number 2, it's Kalitas, Trader of Get. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 3/4 with lifelink, and if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, you instead exile that card and make a 2/2 zombie token. While that ability is already inherently powerful, Kalitas has an activated ability for 2 generic and a black that lets you sacrifice those tokens, or any other zombie or vampire, to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Kalitas. Transforming any creature of your opponent's who dies into a zombie is serious value, and it doesn't hurt that all your opponent's creatures also get exiled when they go to the graveyard, helping you to disrupt any graveyard shenanigans. Much like the Scarab God, Kalitas is the kind of creature who can utterly dominate in control decks, since he makes blocking and all of your removal spells way better, giving you that zombie value anytime you do those things. Then the lifelink makes it hard for an aggro deck to ever do lethal to you. He was heavily played in Standard, at first primarily in control decks, but later on in his time in Standard, he was played in zombie Typal decks. He's also found success in several other formats like Modern and Legacy, but Pioneer is really the non-standard format where he's really left his mark, and another format where it's a fixture in control decks. He's going to keep seeing lots of play in Pioneer, and right now it's more active than the number 1 card on this list, which only has a small lead. And that card is Liliana the Last Hope. As a Necromancer, Liliana often shows up on zombie payoff cards. We've already seen her a few times on this list, but this is the first time we've seen one of her Planeswalkers. While not every Liliana Planeswalker technically has a zombie payoff effect, Liliana the Last Hope does. For 1 generic and 2 black, she's a 3 loyalty Planeswalker, and her -7 is where zombies come in, because she gives you an emblem that makes X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, where X is 2 plus the number of zombies you control. So while the ability makes exponentially more zombies even if you started out with 0, it gets even more unbeatable if you have other zombies in play. She's also got a +1 that gives a creature -2/-1 until your next turn, and a -2 that puts the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then you can return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. The +1 can remove small creatures, or at least weaken them so they aren't as relevant, and her -2 is a great way to stock the graveyard and draw cards. In Standard, she was played in zombie Typal decks that could get the most out of her ultimate, as well as in Delirium decks, which really liked her -2. She's also been played in Pioneer Delirium, and in Modern, she's mostly been played in Death Shadow and Jund, both of which have considerable graveyard synergy. She's also been played in various Legacy decks over the years that like having stuff in the graveyard, including Threshold decks, Death Shadow, and Grixis Control, and she's even gained some points in Vintage Bug midrange. However, she's slowed down a lot in recent years, partly as a result of having fewer good targets for her +1. There just aren't as many creatures these days that she can outright kill with it, and if graveyard-based decks really want a Planeswalker these days, they often turn to Grist the Hunger Tide. As a result, Liliana doesn't have a single point in any format in 2024, and Kalitas, Trader of Get, is likely to pass her in the future, and if she remains inactive, Gravecrawler will probably get there too. So, those are the best zombie payoffs in Magic. If you're looking to build a zombie deck, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at specific creature types, like zombies, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.